are recording.
Okay. Well, thanks again for doing this. This is fun.
Well, it's a great honor. Thank you for being here.
Well, let's. I'm going to try to go through this chronologically.
Sure.
Let's start at the beginning here in Springfield. You're a Springfield native. Grew up here. I
Yes.
understand. What's this town mean to you?
Well, it really means just about everything to me. We came here, the family came here in 1939. My parents were immigrants from Sweden. And so I grew up here in the Springfield schools. I started in a one-room schoolhouse and went to two of the local grade schools and then on to Springfield High School. And everywhere that I went, every place I was involved, people helped me. And I got into high school, was a pretty good athlete, and I was helped even further. And people started supporting me to go to the Naval Academy. Important people who had the ability to provide some strong recommendations. Went on to the University of Illinois for a year on a scholarship when the Naval Academy appointment kind of got hung up. But then was appointed by Congressman Peter Mack and got to the Naval Academy, which was the best thing that could happen to me at that point. It was a way to go forward, and it was a way to be somebody.
When did you get interested in the Navy to begin with?
I think it was because I liked the Army-Navy football games. I would listen to those games in the late 40s, and they were great games. It's when Army had their big team, and Navy was really not much of anything at all, except those games were very close. And somehow the fight of the Navy team was something that I picked up as something I wanted to be involved with. And the Academy sent one of their midshipmen here, who, and I've forgotten his name, I'm sorry. But they sent him here to interview me, talk to me about why don't you try to go to the Naval Academy. And the Academy couldn't contact you directly. It was against the rules. But they said, well, if you write this gentleman, Rip Miller, who was the Naval Academy's athletic director, very famous athletic director, one of the 7 mules at the University of Notre Dame back in the days of the Four Horsemen. I wrote him, and he said, okay, we'll work with you. And they did, and with the local people, and to get me that appointment. And of course, I looked at the brochures and other things, and I just saw that this was a special place, the Naval Academy.
Was there an instant, or you mentioned destroyers first?
Yes.
But I'm just curious, were destroyers and your interest in submarines?
Well, in my day, you had to, in order to get to submarines, you had to go to the fleet first and qualify as what was called the officer of the deck. And the destroyer was the best surface ship assignment in my view, because it was a pretty active ship, and that's, you learn a lot of real seamanship on a destroyer. And so I went first to a destroyer. I spent 3 years on that ship. Did pretty well, ended up as a chief engineer, and the captain kept saying, no, you don't want to go to submarines. You want to stay in the surface Navy, and you're doing well. And lo and behold, I got orders to, and this was very unusual, to command a patrol craft escort. It was an experimental patrol craft escort, rescue. All of those letters were in there, EPCER. USS Marysville. It was a ship. It was about 180 feet long, about 1,000 tons, and it had 5 officers and 60 men. And I was a lieutenant junior grade, and that was quite an opportunity to be the commander of a ship like that. And to me, it looked like a battleship. I mean, my gosh, to control that ship was a great challenge. So I went to that for about a year, and then it reached the point 4 years after I was out of the academy, and that was the limit before you could go into submarines, for you to get into submarines, and I put in my request for submarines.
What was the appeal of submarines?
Their operations are unique. They're independent. The captain makes the decisions. He gets his patrol orders, training, guidance, and all before you go, and then when you go, you do what you think is right. Try to carry out your mission, but it's that independence that kind of the last of the Corsairs concept. And then, of course, the people in submarines were so extraordinary. All volunteers, all very, very bright. The only reason the enlisted men weren't officers was probably they hadn't been to college or hadn't been to college enough. But they were clearly as smart or smarter than you were. And so it was a wonderful, very small, close community.
Now you would have come on board probably in the mid to late 50s with that?
Came aboard my first submarine, actually, I went to submarine school in 1959. I graduated from the academy in 54.
Okay.
3 years on a destroyer, a year on the Marysville, and then into training, submarine training, which was 6 months in New London, submarine school. And so I got to my first submarine in the fall of '59.
This is the height of the Cold War.
Yeah, it was really starting to build. That was really when it really started to build from a technological point of view in submarines.
And that's the thing that's so interesting to me. Nuclear power it was proved with Nautilus years before that. The nuclear ships are coming online. And what did they do in terms of, well, obviously submarines are stealthy,
Yes.
but this gave them almost limitless
Yes.
operational capability.
Absolutely, yes. The development of that time was incredible. It's a great story in itself. There's been a couple of books written about it, and of course, I was involved with Admiral Rickover for so many years. I know a lot about what was in the background, or some what was in the background, and but you know, he physically and mentally intimidated the Navy to build a nuclear submarine, the Nautilus. And of course, it went to sea in '55 or so. He got Admiral Nimitz to support him. Without that support, he'd have never got it. Which was just showed you the far-reaching skill process of Admiral Nimitz, and who became the Chief of Naval Operations after World War II. And of course, the submarine proved itself, went under the ice. You recall Sputnik occurred. We were all very concerned. We were behind technology with the Soviets. A lot of pressure on, hey, we need to get this submarine developed as fast as possible. The under ice mission was really a response to Sputnik. If you go back in the timing and the involvement of Rickover and Nimitz and President Eisenhower. Eisenhower wanted to go immediately under the ice, and Rickover said, no, we're not quite ready. And that's a good story in itself. I could take up the whole time with it. And then another great Navy Admiral Rayburn, Red Rayburn, developed the submarine-launched ballistic missile. And now this you're talking about between 1955 and 1960. You're not talking about a lot of time.
And this is a real game changer.
Oh, incredible. And so in those 5 years, you went from Nautilus to a nuclear attack submarine, the Skipjack class. The Fleet Ballistic Missile was designed. They the construction of the skipjack class, put in a big wedge missile tube section. The missile was designed, tested, all came together, went to sea on its first patrol in 1960 as advertised. The most, in my view, incredible achievement, technological achievement, and it put us clearly ahead. Here we had a fleet ballistic missile submarine force, 16 missiles at sea, not all of them, half of them at sea all the time. In those days, it had an accuracy of about a mile, maybe a little bit less. But there they were. And that was the beginning of the strategic deterrence that existed for all those years until the Soviet Union collapsed. It's, in my view, what won the Cold War.
What did it offer the United States in terms of strategic capability that the Soviets didn't have at that time?
Well, they hadn't developed that capability. They did in the late 60s. They started with their own ballistic missile submarine program and missiles, and of course that was their half of the deterrence. I mean, and when I say, I realize there were other means of delivering the missiles, but you know, the submarine delivery was always there. You knew no matter what you did, it was going to come. Whether you silenced the bombers or whether you silenced the land-based ballistic missiles, the submarine missiles were always going to come. And so they worked very hard to develop it. Their ships were not as good. They weren't as quiet. Their missiles were not solid fuel rockets. They were liquid fuel. They certainly didn't have the reliability by a long shot. But it came about 10 years down the pike. But right off the bat, in 1960, we held the aces, and they knew that. And I think you can find, in reading about, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Khrushchev said, "I always worried about the submarines." You know, when they were all thinking about starting a nuclear war, they said, "I was always worried about those submarines." And so it was a step forward, and it really created a great defense for the United States.
When did you get your first submarine command?
I had only one, 3-year command in 1968. The USS Plunger, a nuclear attack submarine. It was a sister ship to the Thresher, USS Thresher, which was lost. Very modern submarine, in 3 years, and that was a height of in my view, the Cold War, 68 to 71. Lots of nose-to-nose operations with the Soviets around the world. Their submarines, their fleet ballistic missile submarines, their attack submarines, their intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that we did all along the Soviet areas, and it was the best submarine we could design at that time, although we had that unfortunate occurrence at the Thresher.
Plunger stayed in service for a long time, I read.
Oh yes, Plunger. I spoke at her decommissioning about 1991. Always a great ship. And still today, many of those crew members stay together on the internet. Every once in a while, I get an email from one of them. Whenever they do something good, they seem to want to tell me about it, which makes me feel good.
What was it for you personally and professionally? What was it like to be in command of such an awesome weapon as that?
Well, it was almost overwhelming. You of course, I'd had a lot of experience, recent experience. I came into submarines, as you know, a little late, but I had been the executive officer of the nuclear attack submarine Snook, and we had from 64 to 66 with a lot of overseas operations, and that was very helpful to me. I had been aboard a fleet ballistic missile submarine for a year, so those were my two nuclear experiences. They ordered me back to Washington to be in the Bureau of Naval Personnel. I thought my career was ended or something. I thought I'd done something wrong. But I went back there to become the assistant program manager for nuclear power, which was mainly involved with recruitment and selection of personnel. But you know, it is there's a lot of training that goes in, as I say. Admiral Rickover provided a lot of training before you went to command of the submarine. You had to go spend about 3 or 4 months in his offices, and at the end of that, you had to take an 8-hour examination. And if you didn't pass it, you didn't go. And it was, frankly, the toughest examination I've ever taken. But you've got a ship with nuclear weapons, which is an awesome responsibility. A deep diving, the Thresher class was built to dive to 1,300 feet. Greater than 30 knots in speed. In a nuclear reactor, and you had about 100 men and 14 officers, and so you had to know pretty much what was going on in that ship, every aspect of its operations, certainly the tactical side, but also on the technical side.
Did you have any close encounters with the Soviet subs?
Well, of course, we all did at one time or another. And we've kept pretty much of that quiet. It's still classified. Of course, that was our job, was to trail Soviet submarines. There's a great unclassified story about how, and this was purposely unclassified here a few years back, for the Smithsonian Institute, for the museum, where one of our submarines trailed a Soviet submarine for some 60 days. And so you can see that would be a tremendously stressful environment, because you're in close contact. You don't want him to contact you. You had to make the right move, but you did everything by passive sonar means. You didn't want to make any noises like active sonar would make if you transmitted a pulse. And so it was kind of like boxing with blindfolds. And so you just kind of had to feel your way there, and you used different geometric constructions using the bearings you were receiving from your sonar. And it was a tough environment. And as you may have read in the book Hunt for Red October, which is another story with me and Tom Clancy, the Soviets, they would respond with the crazy Ivan, they called it, where they turn and run at you, hoping, I think, to collide with you in order to embarrass your program. So when they made those moves, when they sensed you might be there, you had to make the right move to counter it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, you could come very close.
Of course, I love the movie and the book. But
Yeah.
So you know Tom Clancy?
Oh, yeah, I was much involved with that. I was in the Pentagon as the Deputy Chief Naval Operations in the early 80s for submarines. And my people came in and said, Admiral, you got to look at this. There was the book, printed by the Naval Institute Press, never ever referring to any of us. And there it was. And it talked about trailing submarines. Well, we were very careful in those years never ever to indicate that we had the capability to trail a Soviet submarine. I mean, that was just never talked to in anything. And really, including the media, everyone followed that, and you never heard of that. Now all of a sudden this guy writes a book about it. But the other part of it, of course, was the story. But the story that you could trail those submarines was something. And and then he talked in there about the Crazy Ivan and other things. So I went in to see my boss, who is now the Chief of Naval Operations, Jim Watkins, who just passed away last week. A great naval leader. So I went in and said, Admiral, you've got to look at this. And he looked at it and he says, my God, how did you let that happen? I said, I don't know. Nobody ever told us anything about it. So I went back to my office and I got to find out just what the background of this is. So I contacted Tom Clancy. He was an insurance man south of Annapolis in Maryland. And he came. I had lunch in my office with him and talked to him. And I said, "Now, where did you get all this information?" And he said, and this is the first time I ever heard this term. I think he invented the term that the whole world uses today. He said, well, all I did, Admiral, was connect the dots. He said, I went to everything that exists in submarines and your testimonies and other things, and I ferreted all this out. And, well, and at that time I thought, I can't quite be right. Some of the stuff like the Crazy Ivan he got out of somebody's mouth. Mm-hmm. Of course, he was down there in southern Maryland, and we had nuclear power plants being built in those areas, and ex-crewmen there, and I'm sure he wouldn't hesitate to buy a few beers to learn some things. Well, we started there. Of course, Reagan read the book, loved it. And of course and he had him to lunch. But Tom and I became good friends. And subsequent to that, later on, when I was president of Valley Forge Military Academy, he came up and talked to the students. A great American, supports a lot of things that people don't know. Probably the smartest man I've ever met. He has incredible memory. And he started there, and of course I raised a little hell with him about, these kinds of things you've got to check with us, talk with us about. So the next book he wrote, which was Red Storm Rising, he sent me the draft, which is 6 inches thick. Yeah. He said, okay, how about looking at it and tell me what I ought to take out of here? I wrote him back. I said, this talks about the Army, the Air Force, about everything that goes on in the military. I can't take on that responsibility. I said, do whatever you want. Just leave me and my submarines out of it.
Well, it's interesting to know that, oh my God, he really is that accurate.
Oh yeah. One great story about him, after I'd retired, he invited me to his now mansion down in southern Maryland. Funny place. You go up to these big iron gates and you talk into a box and the gates open and you're driving up the hill and, and you see a warning sign, typical highway warning sign that says, caution, tank crossing. And you drive up over the hill and you look and there's a tank. He's got stationed there.
Wouldn't surprise me.
But he showed me during that visit, and I was there, we were there supporting him. He was trying to buy a National Football League team, and he had a TV production crew there and all. And he showed me the memo that he had sent to the British Minister of Defense, telling him how he thought the U.S. would respond in the first Iraq War, in a very detailed 4 or 5 page memorandum, which was quite accurate. The guy, you're right, very accurate.
I also read that you inadvertently perhaps ended up helping Robert Ballard find the Titanic.
Oh yes, well it's a good story too. Of course, Thresher had gone down in '63. Scorpion went down in 1968. We knew where they were. We had not made a detailed examination of the bottom. We did as much as we knew how to do. One of my goals in the Pentagon was to look into that further, especially the Scorpion, because we didn't know why we lost the Scorpion. We pretty much knew why we lost Thresher, which was probably a seawater system failure. And so I put together a program to go out and examine those sites. We had spectacular cameras in those days that had been invented. Brought in young then Bob Ballard from Woods Hole, who was developing all this technology, and said we wanted to do this. And he said, well, you know, very enthusiastic young man, far ahead thinker about other things in the ocean. Of course, a great marine scientist. And he said, you know, one of the things I've always wanted to do, Admiral, was to find the Titanic. He said, now, if you would permit me during this operation, I could spend some of that time searching for the Titanic. And I said, absolutely not. I said, my God, I said, this is a serious operation we're involved with. It's top secret. And it needs to be done properly, and I could never convince anybody that we would have some sort of a cockamamie search for the Titanic associated with these operations involving Thresher and Scorpion. So we went back and forth with that, and I finally kind of grew tired of the discussion. And I said, look, I don't care what you do, but you got to do what I want done, and you got to do it for the price that I'm willing to pay you. And if you've got some time left over, if you want to look for her, you can do that. At the time thinking, he'll never find the Titanic. So I'm in my office one day. Of course, that was about 1982, 83. He looked at Thresher first. He did the Thresher site. Following year, he went out to look at the Scorpion. Did a good job at both of them. But on the Scorpion search or operation, he called. We got a call back, and my aide came in and said, Bob Ballard's on the phone. So I got on the phone with him, and he said, Admiral, I can't tell you very much because this is not a covered phone. He said, but I want you to know we found it. And I said, you found what? I mean, you know, we knew where the Scorpion was. He said, I can't tell you anymore, but they want you to meet us in Portsmouth with the press to make the announcement. And hung up, and I thought, my God, we found the Titanic. So I went up to see my boss again, old Jim Watkins, who, you know, I'd known for so many years. I'd been his exec on the Snook years before, and I said, Admiral, I've got good news and bad news. He said, what's the good news? I said, we found the Titanic. He said, oh my God, that's incredible. What's the bad news? I said, we don't have a program authorization to go search for the Titanic, and I'm afraid the Congressional Intelligence Committees will be really upset with us. We went out on top secret operations and included a Titanic search, something that they would never, I think, approve. He said, well, you better go tell the Secretary of the Navy. John Lehman, wonderful Secretary of the Navy, you know, really built the Navy up. Enthusiastic young fellow, smart. And so I went in there and I said, Mr. Secretary, I've got good news. He said, what is it? I said, we found the Titanic. He said, oh, that's wonderful. He kind of jumped up behind his desk, as I recall. And I said, on top of that, and of course Lehman was a great politician, I said, on top of that, they want you to meet him in Portsmouth in order to make the announcement. He said, well, of course I'll do that. Well, then I slid out of that room before he ever said, you know, what the next question was, well, what were you doing looking for the Titanic? And of course he informed President Reagan. Reagan was very pleased with it, so nobody ever took us to task. It was an unauthorized program that produced the finding. That was kept secret until, the part of it about the decision-making process was kept secret until the 90s, and then National Geographic had me come back, and they did a program here about 5 or 8 years ago.
See, I didn't know it had anything to do with Thresher and Scorpion.
Oh yeah,
I had no idea.
If you get up on the internet and you can see, there's a couple of programs about it that have a similar name, but the one that National Geographic did, which was very good. Matter of fact, they had somebody playing me, which was unusual. Titanic, The Final Secret. So if you get up and look through it, it's up there.
Well, it was funny. I was going through your career and doing the typical Google search and stuff. I'm like, Titanic? Really? And I'm like, I had no idea. I'm going to have to ask him about this. You were Chief of Naval Operations for submarines. What?
Deputy Chief of Naval.
Chief. Mm-hmm. What was that period, Ron? When was that?
Well, that was a long time. It was almost 5 years. From 1981, I came in. Same time Reagan came in and left in 85. Through the entire Reagan buildup, when I came in, I remember sitting at I had been Commander Submarine Force Pacific, was a young guy. Rickover was leaving. I had been fairly close to Rickover. I'd worked for him directly. So I'm sure he helped that quite a bit. So there I was in the Pentagon as the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, not experienced at all in the Pentagon. I'd been in the Bureau of Naval Personnel, had no Pentagon experience, and really didn't know exactly what I would do next. Of course, I was responsible for all submarine programs, some $18 billion worth of expenditures, and I went to my first C&O executive board, and they talked about shipbuilding, and they hardly said anything about submarine building. I remember I asked the question, well, shouldn't we be building more submarines this year? Well, we don't know. We'll have to take a look at it. Maybe we'll build 1 or 2. Well, that's where it started. 5 years later, I left the Pentagon. We were building 5 nuclear attack submarines and 1 fleet ballistic missile submarine every year. It was a tremendous buildup, and really sponsored by President Reagan and John Lehman, and of course Jim Watkins. Admiral Watkins was a submariner, and this is really what put the pressure on the Soviets, that this force was an unstoppable force. And of course, when the threat came for the strategic, the SDI program, when that came and the Soviets saw that and they saw the tremendous buildup, they realized that we were in the driver's seat. And of course, in my view, that was key to breaking the back of the Soviet Union. They couldn't deal with it.
It's funny, I've had conversations with people who were in Reagan's cabinet at that time. Another Illinoisan, Jean Kirkpatrick.
Oh yeah, I know her. Yes.
And I said, so did you see this coming? Did you see the fall of the Berlin Wall? She said, no. And if anybody tells you they did, they're crazy. But she said, we didn't know that we were being as effective as we were.
The great story, Jean Kirkpatrick's great story. She told it to me in the 90s when she came up to Valley Forge. And she's written this story in her books about Keflavik, about when Reagan was dealing with Gorbachev. And Gorbachev said, okay, well, we're happy to modify the nuclear arms limitation treaty. We'll go along with what you want. And we want you, of course, to give up this SDI program. And of course, this is what Jean told me. Reagan said, stopped the conference. He said, the conference is over, got up, walked out. And Jean Kirkpatrick said, I was running after him saying, Mr. President, I mean, what's wrong? What's the problem? And he turned to her and said, we've won. And he said, don't you realize that they wouldn't do that if they didn't think that they couldn't stop us? And it's a great story. And of course, I don't know where that was in relation to the timing that she talked to you about, but he was the one who saw it with that event. And of course he had put together this force and completely overwhelmed them without firing a shot. And he meant to do that from the beginning. And I saw that in '81. I mean, when all of a sudden all of this money came into submarines.
And today, you know, the senior people who were there and had an idea of what was going on can appreciate that. But to those of us who grew up under the threat of nuclear war and everything, to almost instantly have that threat removed from the world scene, you know, we owe him a lot.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was, and it was so well done. Without, excuse me, I'll just take a little sip of water here. They were developing the SDI at all the major laboratories in the country. I remember I flew over Sandia. I went out to Sandia, but as we flew over, there was this giant field of capacitors. Capacitors the size of a person or bigger, all, you know, like a huge graveyard, all putting together the electrical charge necessary to develop the weapon that would go along with SDI. I remember flying over that and I thought, my God, I mean, look at that. And I thought, the Soviets must fly over that every day with their satellites. And they're looking down and saying, my heavens, they're going to do it. They're going to develop this system that will counter their ballistic missiles. And so it was well done. Now, at the time, it was, from what I could tell, we still had a long way to go. But nobody else knew that.
I knew one of the Army generals who was in charge of that. I went to church with him for a while. Mm-hmm. Eventually became an Episcopal priest in his retirement. Interesting. Now, after being deputy commander or
deputy chief of naval operations,
how does the Seawolf development come out of that?
Well, it was a good ship. As I say, today's fleet or today's combat commanders, used to be called sinks, say that they wish we had built more, because this would have been the ship as we envisioned the ship of the 21st century. This would have been the ship to go into the Far East today, go wherever it wants, and threaten the Chinese if necessary in order to maintain the current situation without war. It's a great ship. I about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit more, I got a call from a 4-star admiral who in my day was a young commander. He and his friend, who was a young commander, was also a 4-star admiral, 2 of them. They called me and said, Admiral, wouldn't you like to go to sea on one of the SSN-21s? They just built the last one. And I said, oh, I'd like it very much. Of course, they knew I'd been so much involved with its development. And I called my heart doctor. I have a pacemaker. I said, what do you think? You know, there's big electrical turbine generators and a lot of electromagnetics running around. He said, well, and I said, I'd really like to go. He said, why don't you go and we'll fix it if something happens. So I went to sea on it. It was a magnificent ship. It did everything that we designed it to do. One example, I think the quietest ship in the world at that point, and I think the fastest. I think it's probably still the fastest, and probably still the quietest. But one of the things I wanted done in that was that you could fire torpedoes without making any noise. Well, normally that's a very noisy operation, where you open the doors and you pulse air into the torpedo tube with water, and the torpedo goes out, but that's a lot, big noise. And we had to design a special pump that everybody said could never be designed. So I'm up in the torpedo room with the captain and these two admirals, and I said, I want to hear these torpedo tubes operate. I want to see what you got after it was all over. So we're standing there talking. I turned to the captain, I said, well, when are you going to shoot the torpedo tube? He said, we already did. And I said, I didn't hear anything. He said, that's right. So it did everything, that conceptual design, the single sheet characteristics, and you'll find arguments. Norman Polmar will argue with me on it. He and I have kind of argued over the years about submarines. He's a good friend, but we've always been a little bit at loggerheads. We'll say, well, it didn't do all the things. Yes, it did. I think today we wish we'd keep building them, because the three of them are capital ships of the Navy. When I said the battleship of the Navy, I said it wrong. Where I got in trouble was I would call them the capital ship of the Navy. And that didn't go over well.
We talked about this before we started rolling here, but we didn't get it in the interview. What sets the SSN 21s apart from anything that's out there today for the viewers watching this?
Well, it's heavily armed, 50 torpedo stowage spaces or cruise missile storage spaces, twice as many tubes, fastest ship, as I said, just about in the world, the quietest. It certainly capable with its nuclear power plant of going anywhere and being there a long while. It can threaten not only the sea, and for many years I've believed anyway that we the submarine force control the sea, but it can also threaten targets ashore now with the Tomahawk cruise missile and the follow-on missiles. It is the ideal weapon for the combatant commander. It gives him a lot of flexibility. And one of the things I said to you earlier, and I've always firmly believed about the submarine, and it's certainly true of this submarine, you can build a cruiser and you get a cruiser, good cruiser. You build a submarine and you build a navy. And nobody knows where the submarine is. It does know it has great capability, and it could be there and threaten you, land or at sea.
As we come to the end of this, Ron, what would you say was your greatest professional accomplishment, or what's given you the greatest satisfaction?
Well, my submarine command tour was great experience. 3 years, a lot of time at sea. I think in 1970 we spent 300 days at sea, involved with some very exciting operations that all turned out okay. There were a few moments of concern that they might turn out okay, but it was that submarine command tour. And you were, as I said earlier, you were that corsair. You went off and you did your thing, and you tried to do what your superiors wanted, but you always ended up doing a lot more or a lot differently than they expected. So that has got to be my number one event, and I would go back. If I had to put down a number two, I would say graduating from the Naval Academy.
After the Navy, you involved with Valley Forge Military?
Yes, I became the president at Valley Forge Military Academy, there for 3+ years. I started having a lot of back problems. As I said to you earlier, 2 weeks ago I had my 4th back operation, so it's something that has been going on for some time. What it proved was that I was too tall for submarines, but I learned that too late.
But now today you're still active, you're still doing stuff?
Yes, there was a local company, a small company, EVT Global Incorporated, and we design and build unique motors. You'd think we know everything there is to know about motor design. Well, we don't. There's a local inventor in Fairbury, Illinois, Norman Rittenhouse, quite an inventor who's invented a unique motor, permanent magnet motor that can operate at very high torque and at low speed. So we're developing that and now starting to provide it for the Navy and in the swimmer delivery vehicles for the SEALs. We're operating with the SEALs and others, and also with the commercial industry for mining trucks and major trucking installations. It's been a lot of fun. It's a small business, a lot of satisfaction because we've got a concept that works, and now you've got to sell it. It's kind of like the SSN-21, and you've got to sell it to a lot of people to get support. We've gotten that support. We're starting to build on it. So it's kind of a great way to go, although it's certainly nothing magnificent that might be published in the Wall Street Journal.
Still get consulted by the Navy on things?
And all of us go back periodically and talk to the various commanders. The Commander Submarine Force, who was in Norfolk, has us back periodically to tell us what's going on, clears us, and tells us what's going on and gets our comments, which I think is a great idea. Because we'll look at him and say, "You're doing what?" One of the things in submarines that I found over the years that you need to do a lot of historical research. I started back, the first USS Plunger was the first active duty submarine in the Navy, the SS-1. Teddy Roosevelt went to sea on it. He was so excited about it that he authorized submarine pay. It was a gasoline-powered submarine. They used to talk about how the submarines would be going up and down and up and down off in the New London area because Roosevelt authorized submarine pay, $1 a dive. So they would surface and dive and surface and dive. But you go all the way back through those years, especially the developments by the Germans, by our forces in World War II, great stories, wonderful heroes. And then as we went on and developed the nuclear submarine, you relied an awful lot on that. I spent a lot of time when I was a submarine commander up in the classified libraries at SubPac reading the patrol reports of our World War II submarines. I learned so much from that. And so I found that that research is important if you're going to go ahead and develop something important for the future.
I think we're at the end. Thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure.
It's thrilling. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.
Oh.
I'm very impressed with how much you knew about submarines when you came.
Well, it's a hobby. I was